Our first question is, what does it mean? What are the implications of the fact that Adam was created from the ground, from the Adamah, and he will return to the ground? We understand that this is a concept of mortality. Is this simply a statement of mortality as a punishment for the sin of Adam? Or does this suggest something about burial? That burial seems to be the Torah's preferred way of dealing with the deceased. The truth is that this is not our key source for the concept of burial. That this really needs to be taken at face value. That there's a concept of mortality which has become part of the human experience since the first episode in the Garden of Eden. And we have to zoom ahead to Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 22 to 23, to see where the source of the concept of burial is. Now, the punishment for an idolater after they are executed for their sin is to be hung by the wrists until sunset. The verse says, "And if a man has sinned in such a way as to be liable to capital punishment," we're talking specifically about idolaters here, "and he is executed and hung on the tree, you shall not allow his corpse to remain there, but rather you shall bury it on that same day. For any hanging corpse is a desecration to God, and you may not defile the land that the Lord your God has given you as an inheritance." So again, the verse refers to someone who has committed a capital offense and has been executed. The bodies of such people would be hanged until sunset in order to deter others from committing the same offense. When you see somebody hanging there, that's a very stark image, and definitely gives a person pause as they pass by. And you find out when you see this corpse hanging from a tree that the reason why it's there is because this person was just executed in the court. And therefore, that is supposed to inspire a sense of fear and to warn others from committing the same offense. But it's not permitted to leave the corpse hanging. Why? Because the human body is created in the image of God. And therefore, it must be treated with the respect that one would show other objects of holy status. The physical body is used to serve God, is used to create a better world, is used to do mitzvot. So therefore, it's not like we will find in many other religions that tend to bifurcate between the spiritual and the physical, and really despise the physical, despise the body as being the main thing that keeps the soul down. The Torah does not look at the physical world that way. The Torah looks at the physical world as the place where we serve God, and the physical body as the instrument of serving God and of fulfilling our potential as spiritual people in the world. So even though this is an idolater, and we would judge this person on the continuum of right and wrong, obviously, and we don't have any love for idolatry. The Torah hates it because God hates it. The reason why there is this kind of public humiliation is because of that. Rashi comments on our verse in Deuteronomy and says the following thing. A hanging corpse is a desecration of the king, for man was made in his image. And he indicates that Israel is his firstborn. The idolater who has been hung on the tree is a Jew who has committed the sin of idolatry. And obviously a person who's in that position for that reason has gone very far from what his intended purpose in the world, this intended mission in the world is supposed to be. And then he gives a parable of two identical twin brothers in order to analogize this situation. Two identical twin brothers, one becomes the king, and the other a highway robber who was caught and then hung. Anyone who sees his hanged corpse will say, the king has been hanged. Now, this is Rashi is explaining to us what is it, why is it that, let's say, the swinging body of an executed sinner, why is that a desecration to God? Because again, they have the concept of Tselem, Elokim, the image of God that the human being was created in. Now, that's a very interesting idea because it almost sounds like God is like we're like twins with God. We human beings are twins with God. This is, of course, not meant in a physical sense. The verse in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27 says, Vayivra Elokim et ha'adam b'tzalmo, that God created man in his image. B'tselem Elokim bara'oto, in the image of God did he create him. Zachar u'nekeva bara'otam, male and female he created them. This is an interesting verse which needs explanation. It's exactly what is meant by saying that we have been created in the image of God. Does God have an image? We'll get to that in a second. But basically, we find in the Sefer HaMitzvot of the Rambam the following. We're commanded to bury those who have been executed by the court on the day of their execution. The verse states, you shall surely bury him. That's our verse from Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 22. This is a positive commandment. This is a positive mitzvah. And then the Rambam tells us, as we learn out in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, it extends to all of the dead, meaning to say that what we would call a binyan av case, right? Our basic paradigm of the concept of the requirement of burial comes from this case of the idolater who has been hanged. But we learn from that case and extend it to any deceased person, meaning that all Jewish corpses must be buried on the day of their death. Therefore, any case where the deceased have no one to see to their burial is considered meit mitzvah. Meit mitzvah means that the obligation to bury that person is upon whoever is the first one to encounter the dead body. You find the dead body, you have to bury it. Why? Because the verse states, Kavor tikbarena, you shall surely bury him. So we see here that the concept that Jewish people must be buried on the day of their death is based on that verse in Deuteronomy. And just going back for a second to the idea of the image of God. There's a difference of opinion between the Rambam and another one of the Rishonim, whose name is Rabbeinu Bachya, on the one hand, and the Radak, Reb David Kimchi. These are some of our greatest thinkers. The Radak gives us one of the more prominent explanations of the Tanakh, of the prophets and the writings. There's an argument between the Rambam and Rabbeinu Bachya and the Radak regarding the expressions which mean image. And we have two different words, really three, but two main words that are often translated as image. One of them is the word Tselem, which is the word that appears in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, when we say that man was created in God's image. And the other word is demut, which can be often translated as likeness. Rabbeinu Bachya explains that the word Tselem means a type of intellectual achievement. It's not a picture. It's not a physical picture. Meaning it's like the essential idea of something. which is completely different than the word demut, which refers to the outward form of a thing, like its real physical appearance. The Rambam explains those who interpret the verse which says the image of God to mean anything corporeal or physical are committing heresy, for God has no physical form. So the Tselem cannot represent anything physical. The Radak, on the other hand, links the two words, Tselem and Demut, not to suggest that God has a physical form, but that the form that man takes is a physical manifestation, let's say, of God's blueprint, of God's idea of what man should be. Because when we looked at that Rashi before, it almost sounds like you have God and you have people, and people are like a physical reflection of God. That's not a possibility, because God has no physical form. And not only that, but Rashi used the word demut. He said in the Hebrew version of the Rashi commentary that we just read was Adam asui demut diukno, that man was created in the demut of God, which is a word that, again, ordinarily refers to the outward form of something. So what we can say, based on what we understand from these various different opinions, that Rashi was not using these terms, let's say, in a scientific way, but because they have a related meaning, they were becoming interchangeable. But it's not to suggest in any way that God has a likeness of any kind. That, as we know, is one of the 13 principles of faith that we have, that God is entirely non-corporeal. What is all of this about, though? We have been given an extreme case of somebody who has committed what can be said to be the absolute worst sin in the Torah, which is the sin of idolatry. That's the worst spiritual sin. Idolatry, in the most general sense, is simply the belief that anything other than God himself controls anything in the world. Okay, that is the absolute worst spiritual mistake you can make. So therefore, we have somebody who has committed the worst thing, and therefore is punished with death, and then has their corpse hung on a tree, publicly displayed, for other people to be deterred from this thing. And nevertheless, the Torah demands that we bury that corpse on the same day, because that corpse has been created in the image of God. And it is the idea of being created in the image of God that gives us our concept of human dignity. And the Torah, it very carefully protects human dignity. That is the fundamental principle that underlies what we are supposed to do with the deceased. Now, the Torah's requirement of burial for Jews is based on this idea. The fact that this is not a Torah requirement for B'nai Noach, for Noahides, does not mean that they don't possess the human dignity of having been created in the image of God. It just happens to not be one of the mitzvot B'nai Noach. It is not a requirement for Noahides to bury their dead. They have a variety of different options for how to handle that. We see in the Torah that the Torah's response to the inherent human dignity that is imparted to people by virtue of having been created in the image of God is burial, and that therefore becomes a requirement for people. But we have to understand that burial is an expression, is a response to that human dignity, is a response to the fact that the physical body is essentially a holy vessel. Now, for Noahides, nevertheless, even though, again, they don't need to be buried, technically they could be cremated. When it comes to organ donation, it's absolutely something that is a possibility. We'll get more into the concept of organ donation in a different shiur. If you have questions specifically about organ donation, ask it during the Q&A, or just indicate that that's something that you're thinking about, because I will be putting together shiurim on various different of these topics. But nevertheless, the insights from the Torah regarding burial and the dignity of human life do carry meaningful implications for Noahides. The specific commandment to bury the deceased on the day of their death is directed towards Jews. The broader principles underlying these teachings, though, have universal relevance for all of humanity, including Noahides. So we have to consider, again, Noahides, like Jews, recognize the inherent sanctity and dignity of human life. So we learn from here something sort of like what we call a kal v'chomer, meaning to say that if it applies here, it certainly applies here. What we learn from the fact that you must treat the dead with respect is that all the more so we must treat every person, living or deceased, with respect and compassion. The customs surrounding death, burial, and mourning are referred to as chesed shel emet, the true chesed, the true kindness. Why is this chesed shel emet as opposed to any other nice thing that you might do for somebody during their lifetime? Because in the case of the deceased, what we do to preserve their dignity and to relate to their bodies with respect is a kindness that cannot be reciprocated. It's pure kindness, because this is something that we do for somebody who cannot respond in kind. That's why it's called chesed shel emet. And again, it boomerangs backwards. In other words, the Torah's emphasis on the respectful treatment of the deceased, even in cases of capital punishment, underscores an ethical responsibility to honor the sanctity of life. And this principle encourages Noahides to adopt compassionate and dignified practices when dealing with the remains of the deceased within their communities. The beauty of the Noahide community, as we see it developing right in front of us, is that it encompasses people from so many different parts of the world and many different cultures with many different practices, not all of which would be out of step with what the Torah asks and can be brought in. And I think it's important for people to consider the elements of the cultural context that they come from that have meaning for them when it comes to dealing with this kind of a thing, rather than making a blanket ritual for Noahides with regard to this. And also, there's ethical guidance and wisdom from Torah teachings on end-of-life matters. So, requirements aside, there's something instructive in Torah for Noahides, that understanding the underlying principles of these teachings allows Noahides to incorporate meaningful practices into their communities that align with the universal values that are upheld by the Torah. And it's something that Noahides might find inspiration when it comes to building supportive and caring communities that take responsibility also for the respectful treatment of the deceased. How that's going to play out will be interesting. Will there be a Noahide burial society? Will we be looking for plots of land where people can be buried according to Torah law or according to some expression of it? these are all different types of practical and logistical issues that I think are definitely important food for thought, and might speak to some of us. It's becoming an issue in the world in general as treatment of the dead. In terms of let's say the traditional way that societies have related to the dead, change over time. The more secular society becomes, the less important a lot of the old rituals seem to people, and many of these rituals emanate out of the Torah itself. So it's something that we have to take into consideration. Also, as land becomes more and more scarce, the ability to possess burial property in some countries, I understand in the Netherlands it's this way, that you're not really guaranteed that when you bury a relative that you will always have that. You don't get perpetual care necessarily, but there are probably solutions to that as well. So all these things, we are at the beginning of the story of the development of the Noahide world in this regard. So it could be that innovative solutions will come out of this community. I'd be very interesting. I would be very interested to hear what people come up with. But again, compassion, empathy, and kindness does not end with the end of life. I think that's the key element that I want to emphasize here. Noahides are ethical monotheists, and they can promote these values within their communities and foster an environment that values and upholds the dignity of every individual throughout their life and beyond. And very much what we do when we treat the deceased with honor and with respect is we are extending their life beyond the physical, because our connection to them is deepened this way. The ability to visit somebody at their gravesite and to commune with them and to maintain that connection, very, very important. So in essence, while we have specific commandments that might not directly apply to Noahides, the universal principles derived from Torah teachings encourage a deep appreciation for the sanctity of life, the dignity of every person, and the ethical treatment of the deceased. Noahides can draw upon these principles to shape their cultural practices and ethical frameworks in a manner that reflects the timeless wisdom of the Torah and bring much deeper meaning to what is inherently a very, very important part of life. One of my teachers told me that one of his favorite things was funerals. It wasn't because he relished the thought of anybody losing a loved one or because he didn't care about the sadness and the grief that people went through, but the opportunity for a real meaningful connection to the person who has passed. There are very few opportunities like that to really solidify your relationship with somebody, no pun intended. So I think what we can take from this is that there's no point at which a person's honor becomes disposable, that we utilize the phenomenon of death and mourning as a way of gently and compassionately shepherding this person from this world to the next world. And in the merit of ethical treatment of the deceased, we should enjoy healthy and bountiful long life on earth.